as we have for over a week now in the Middle East. Despite growing international pressure for a ceasefire, the deadly conflict between Israeli forces and Hamas is escalating. This morning, airstrikes left at least 6 people dead in Gaza. It comes after a spokesman for the Israeli military said yesterday that as long as rockets are being fired at Israel, de-escalation is not on the table. So far, the fighting has killed over 200 Palestinians and at least a dozen Israelis. Both include children among their dead. Holly Williams reports.
The West Bank erupted. The Palestinians called it a day of rage. The Palestinians have been throwing stones, and the Israeli soldiers who were about 300 yards away on that hillside have been shooting tear gas canisters and live fire. Dozens of Palestinians were reported injured and 4 killed. Israel claims 2 soldiers were shot in the leg, though we saw no guns on the Palestinian side. Many Palestinians feel powerless. Just listen to Maysoon Ali, a banker who told us she used to live in the US.
If you are living in Washington, D.C. or in Chicago or in L.A., accept the neighbor to come and take a piece of land or a piece of furniture from your house, nobody accepted.
Hamas, a group considered a terrorist organization by the US, has fired more than 3,000 rockets at Israel since last week, killing 2 civilians. In retaliation, the tiny, poverty-stricken Gaza Strip has been shattered by Israeli airstrikes. Around 50,000 people have now fled their homes, and more than 200 have been killed, according to Palestinian officials. Israel says it's targeting militants, but according to Mohammed al-Hadidi, there was no warning before the strike that killed his wife and 4 sons. Only his 5-month-old baby Omar was saved from the rubble. More than 60 children have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, according to Palestinian figures, and the fighting continues. Israel's defense minister said on Tuesday they have thousands more Hamas targets in their sights. Holly Williams, CBS News, Tel Aviv.
Well, Robert Berger is in Jerusalem and joins us now with more. Robert, thanks for joining us. Listen, I'm going to start with a question that I ask everyone who is in the region right now. For you, what is the latest on the ground there? What have you seen? What have you heard? What do you know?
The fighting is continuing. It's very tense. Right now, as we speak, Israel is pounding Gaza with airstrikes, targeting, according to the military, tunnels, commanders, and even politicians. Now, this has caused mass destruction in Gaza. There is a growing humanitarian crisis, shortages of food, fuel, and water. And then on the Israeli side right now, they're under rocket attacks. Southern Israel, people are hunkering down in their homes, and that's already been going on now for 10 days.
So we've been getting sort of mixed messages. There are conflicting reports that Israeli forces and Hamas may have reached a ceasefire this Thursday. Are you hearing anything about that?
Yeah, the ceasefire made a lot of news of the so-called ceasefire. It's actually a ceasefire proposal for Thursday morning, and it has not been accepted. Israel quickly came out and said reports that there is a ceasefire or that Israel agreed to a ceasefire are not true. The Israelis say they have a lot more targets to hit, and they intend to go after Hamas. They didn't say really how long. What I'm hearing from political sources is maybe a day or 2, but also from the Hamas side, they say they haven't agreed to a ceasefire either. So right now, neither side is really on board.
And yesterday we spoke about plans for a protest in the form of a strike. Palestinians went on a rare strike yesterday, leaving many streets empty in Israel. What was the message they were hoping to send? What were they hoping to accomplish?
Well, the strike was very successful. It was widely, if not completely, observed in Israeli Arab towns and also in the West Bank. And with people off from universities and schools and from work, it spilled over onto the streets with violent clashes between Israeli troops and Palestinian stone throwers. And that's raising fears that the violence in Gaza could spread further into the West Bank.
In fact, the Israeli embassy held a briefing yesterday where their military spokesman said that as long as rockets are being fired at Israel, de-escalation is not on the table. This echoes what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said about military operations continuing in order to restore calm. What more can you tell us about this?
Well, 4,000 rockets have been fired at Israel in the past 10 days. So it's clear, they've said so publicly, the Israelis, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, that while Israeli cities and towns are under rocket fire, Israel is going to keep going after the people who are responsible. So Israel says it's got no shortage of targets, even though it's launched hundreds of airstrikes over the past 10 days. Now it wants to go after what it's calling high-profile targets, senior commanders and politicians from Hamas.
So President Biden was in Dearborn, Michigan yesterday. It's a city with the largest population of Arab Americans in the U.S. And then during his presser at a Ford plant, Biden mispronounced Michigan's Democratic Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, mispronounced her name. He dropped the A off of her first name. She is Arab American. And Biden was also asked by a reporter if he could take a quick question about Israel. And his reply was, "Not unless you get in front of the car as I step on it." And then he said, "I'm only teasing." I'm wondering if people there in Israel were watching those comments, and if so, what do they think?
Actually, that didn't make news here, but in the broader picture, I think Israelis are pleased and even surprised by President Biden's support and what he calls quiet diplomacy. They have not come out publicly demanding a ceasefire from Israel. They have told Israel, and President Biden told Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu personally that he would like to see a ceasefire. He wants to see things wind down. But basically, the president has supported Israel's right of self-defense. So overall, the Israeli people are pleased and actually surprised by the support from the president.
The U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said yesterday that Washington did, in fact, receive information regarding Israel's destruction of the Gaza building housing the Associated Press and other media outlets. Just to remind people, Israel argued that there were Hamas offices in there. Members of the media who work out of that building had said they were unaware of anything like that. They were given a heads up, and everyone was able to clear out of the building. Have you heard anything more about this information?
The Israeli military has not shared this information publicly because it's in the field of intelligence. So actually, as far as the public or journalists, it's sort of a he said, she said. Whose word are you going to take? I would say that Hamas is known to operate in civilian areas. That's not a secret. You could argue that they probably thought this was a building because it houses the AP. The Associated Press, that Israel would probably never target a building where international media operate. But on the other side, Hamas said, no, they didn't have offices there. And also the journalists that work in the building say they didn't know about any Hamas offices in the building. The Israelis say it housed Hamas military intelligence.
All right, Robert Berger, thank you so much for bringing us up to speed, and stay safe. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
So at 10:45 Eastern, Vlad and I will be speaking with former Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, on the latest fighting going on between Israelis and Palestinians, as well as diplomacy tactics that could possibly help bring calm to the region. You can stream that right here on CBSN.